Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for joining us for our discussion of Wild River. I'll just wait till everybody comes on in. Let me please remind you that you should please stay muted unless and until I call on you. The way that I will know to call on you is you can use the raise hand function in your Zoom window. If you raise your hand, I will call on you to make your question or comment, and then you please unmute yourself and share it with us. And then after you've stated it or asked it, please mute yourself and we'll go from there. You can also use the chat function if you want to talk with each other about something that's going on or ask questions of each other or share resources or the like. I would also ask you to please, if you are not a regular patron or member of Bryn Mawr Film Institute, if you were from outside of our southeastern Pennsylvania, greater Philadelphia area, please in the chat introduce yourself and say where you're from. We're really curious to know who all is out there and who all is joining us beyond the usual suspects, of which I see a number in the attendee section. So please, with those things in mind, if you have any questions or comments to start us off, please share them. Otherwise, let us get going. Let's see. All right. I don't see, oh, I see that we have a question right off the bat from Robert. Robert, did you have a question or comment?
Oh, thank you. I thought I guess I had a big problem with this movie. When you compare it to the two other movies I know by Elia Kazan, On the Waterfront and A Streetcar Named Desire, I just felt this was just really inferior. I I guess my 3 points that bother me, and I certainly want to hear what you experts have to say. The first is that I felt that the performance, or rather the dialogue that was given to the Montgomery Clift character, I just felt that he was just wooden. I just felt there was no real personality in that man whatsoever. Um, and I didn't understand. Uh, so I guess compared to some of the great characters that were in those other movies of Elia Kazan's, I thought he was very wooden, and whoever wrote the dialogue for him, he just didn't have any personality, to tell you the truth. And for that reason, to me, there was no foundation whatever set for any reason why this very interesting woman, played by Lee Remick, why she would fall in love with him is absolutely beyond me. There was no foundation set in that movie for that love interest or the marriage. I thought it was extremely awkward. I guess I have a problem with the screenplay, maybe. And the third thing is, I realize that there's some public interest here and political view about the whole tension between tradition and people living off their land and sort of native people living there and so-called progress. And I guess I thought that that was very tepid. I mean, the the black people were just so it's the way Hollywood portrayed black people was just shameful. And here we have the same thing going on again. Um, the one black person who had anything to say, the only thing he said was, "Well, I won't sell my dog." That's about as much as we get from black actors in this movie. And I thought if you want to look at a movie which really really explores that whole thing about living off the land and so-called progress, I look at the movie Deliverance,
Hmm.
and that is really deep. That is so much a million times better when you want to go to that theme of the Tennessee Valley Authority and making change and having the water change, and there's going to be flooding and people are going to lose their land. Deliverance did that a million times better. So anyway, the whole thing was very disappointing. So I guess I'm very open to hearing what you experts have to say, because you guys obviously saw a lot of stuff that I didn't see. So thank you for listening.
Okay, Robert, you gave us a lot to tackle there. I will do my best to start, and then I'm sure Jacob will have some additional comments. First, the screenplay. I think if you wanted to say that Paul Osborne is not the screenwriter that Bud Schulberg or Tennessee Williams is, then I wouldn't argue with that. I think that though that these are very different films set in different eras, and I think perhaps most importantly, and this kind of lines up with your criticism of Clift, I think that's a very different character. I mean, this is a TVA New Deal functionary. This is not this is not either the protagonist played by Marlon Brando. And I think to the extent that he seemed stiff or reserved or unemotional or what have you, I think that was by design and was an intentional element of the character. And I think that we've all seen, even though this was later in his career, we've all seen Clift play passion. And I think there were moments of passion that I frankly found very moving and impactful, perhaps because they came at a significant contrast to the way he was the rest of the time. So I think it's not really fair to compare this character or his dialogue to those characters in those films. I think they're different animals. In terms of falling in love, I think if you think about most Hollywood films in general, I was going to say during the classical era, but in general, I think you'd find that there's often very little predicate provided for the love affair between the man and the woman, other than proximity and opportunity. But I think this film has more than that going for it. You can imagine that Lee Remick had never met a man like the Montgomery Clift character. And I think you can think about that or take that in many different ways. She'd never met a man who was so committed to a project and a job that he would, in some cases, it seems, risk his life to fulfill it. She'd never seen a man from the government who had such compassion and empathy for her family and her way of life. She had probably never seen a man who was that highly educated and articulate, if the competition that we see for her affections is any indication. So I think there are a number of reasons why she might have found him to be attractive and on the road to irresistible, for lack of a better term. The last thing regarding the African Americans, I think we need to be careful here, because I think that you're absolutely right that Hollywood has a history of not depicting African Americans in a fair or accurate or positive way, regardless of the historical era or the story subject matter. But I think it's a little more complicated here, because I think the depiction of the African American characters in this movie is complicated by the fact that the film is being critical of the way they are being treated by the white characters, and indeed by, the culture in Tennessee at the time the film is set, the 1930s. And so I don't necessarily think that the criticisms about the movie's depiction of blacks fall squarely on Hollywood's limited ability to do that with perspective and in a comprehensive way. I think a large part of it has to do with the points the film is making about those particular characters and the life that they were sort of limited to living under the circumstances of the sort of, the racial divide and the problems with the system in Tennessee at that time. And then you had another comment that has escaped me. So Jacob, I said a lot. You must have other ideas as well.
Sure, Robert. Thanks for sharing your thoughts with us. I'm gonna there's a lot there, and so I'm going to try to keep my comments brief. So forgive me if I don't touch on everything, but let me do my best to speak to a couple things that you alluded to. To me, I think, for me, the way the film picks up its sort of core themes about tradition versus progress, and individual, rugged individualism versus, say, collective benefit, and kind of to the same in the same vein, this sort of idea of wildness versus this idea of control, nature versus civilization and stuff like that. To me, I think the way the film picks it up is pretty compelling, and it's made more compelling by the way that those themes sort of tie into the relationship between Montgomery Clift and Lee Remick's character, and we can discuss the way that those sort of are entwined, perhaps at another point in our conversation. But to me, these are some of the core, I guess, dynamics or dialectics or whatever in I guess the American identity and the ideology of America. And I think the film sort of tackles this question of what is lost in the sake of progress. What is the cost of progress? For me, at least, it was a compelling treatment. Now, to speak to Lee Remick and also Clift's characters, I saw this pop up a little bit in the chat, but to me, with Remick's character, I'm struck by the moment where she sort of impulsively, almost sort of abruptly, sort of throws herself sort of from the bank of the river onto the boat. It's like the first glimmer, the first notion that this is a way that I could get off of this island. It's like as soon as that idea pops into her head, she can almost not keep her feet still, and she literally takes a leap. And I think that speaks to some of what Clift's character represents for her, which is this sort of connection to this world outside, this little island where she's been living. Now, as for Clift's performance, you're not the only person I've heard to find it a little bit wooden. I have, I suppose, a different take. And I think it's worth watching the way his character develops over the course of the film. There are some ways in which not Montgomery Clift, but the character Chuck Glover, to me at least, seems like a wooden man in maybe the first part of the movie. We see him, we have to ask ourselves, what kind of person is this? Is this a person with integrity? Is this a person who is good at his job? Is this a person who's capable? And what we see, in my mind, in the sort of first maybe 2/3 of the movie, is that when it comes to matters relating to bureaucracy and relating to his job, he's very capable and he has a lot of integrity. When it comes to personal matters, much less. Through the first 2/3 of the movie, he folds in every personal confrontation. He equivocates at any serious conversation or any notion of commitment, on an emotional level. But I think that starts to change in the film, and I think that's one of the narratives, in the film. So, there's this sort of reticence and this sort of softness or this sort of indecisiveness to Clift's character, which is sort of unusual in like a Hollywood movie protagonist. But for me, it sort of speaks to the way that, this is a sort of incomplete man, in the first section of the movie. And I think, in a way, I think that's the sort of basis of that. This sort of various incompletenesses and completenesses of Clift and Remick's characters are part of why they complete each other. Remick is very soulful. She's very grounded. She's very direct and in touch with herself. Clift has a lot of motion. He has a certain kind of capability, but he doesn't have emotional maturity, and and in that sense, perhaps they're a good pair. Anyway, I said I was going to speak briefly, and I certainly didn't. So I'll can it.
And I remembered the last thing that Robert had said, which was comparing this film to Deliverance. And I think even though they're only a dozen years apart, I think there's a dramatic difference between the way and the freedom Hollywood has to deal with a social issue in 1960 versus the freedom it'll have to do that in 1972. But I also think it's something of a different story, but different strokes. Let's see. Dana, you had a question or comment.
Oh, I'm so glad you called on me now. Okay, I'm going to disagree with Robert, and I'm going to give you a hug, Jacob, because I absolutely.
Oh, that was my mistake. Sorry, Dana. I did that.
I'll mute myself. Okay, I'm back.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe that was a Freudian slip. Who knows? Okay.
No.
Jacob, I was delighted by your choice. I watched the film twice. I had never heard about it. I had never read about it. I knew nothing of it. And I'm a real fan of Elia Kazan, so it's a total treat for me. All right, let me say a couple of things about Montgomery Clift and the acting in general. Maybe his acting specifically. One of the things that I felt about him is he was a character who had absolutely no backstory. He came into this, we knew nothing at all about him except that he worked for the Tennessee Valley people. And he refused to allow anybody to learn anything about himself. When the women remarked about him, that they expected somebody older, the response that he gave is, well, I'm younger. And that's pretty much all we ever learn about him. So I thought that was really interesting. And what unfolded for me, which was what I thought was a tremendous acting performance on his part, was he was a blank slate, and he let all of the other actors, and I thought they were all terrific, kind of mesh their characters into him. They kind of became who they became because of how they saw him. I saw him for Lee Remick. He was her ticket out of there, and she sort of turned him into what she wanted him to be. He was really not those things. I mean, she threw herself at him, and he was sort of didn't know what to do about it. He, as you mentioned, he didn't ever fight back. He had principles, but he didn't fight back for them. I saw him as sort of an unformed man, as kind of a child man. I saw him as not necessarily gay, but certainly on the spectrum sexually. And I guess the final thing that I kind of want to point out, two things, because I don't want to talk too long, is first of all, I thought it was really interesting that he is who was chosen to represent progress, as Ella would have said. He was a strange character, an oddball, to represent the newness that was coming from the government that was going to change the way things were. And one last thing about him and all of the other men that I just want to point out, he was hatless. He wore no hat. He's the only male character who didn't have a hat on. And I think that's really very telling too, because this was the changeover 1959, 1960, when men stopped wearing hats. And it was really representative to me that he's the new guy coming in. All of the rest of them wore hats, and wore very distinctive hats. They each had a hat that was sort of in keeping with the personalities of the men. So I'm all over the place here, but I just want to say I really enjoyed it. I loved Montgomery Clift. I could talk forever, but I won't. So thanks again, Jacob, for a terrific recommendation.
Well, thanks for your comments, Dana, and thanks for that interesting perspective on hats. I hadn't given that much thought. And of course, even though the film is in 1930, set in the 1930s, the fact that would have been a way to audiences at the time to sort of mark him as, different, on the leading edge, a change from the usual, is an interesting way to think about it. I'll also say that Kazan started trying to write this screenplay himself. He worked on this for many years, and he had trouble cracking it, and that's why he ultimately, went to other people. He originally had conceived of the Montgomery Clift character being an older man. Kazan had done some work for the New Deal in the Department of Agriculture at that time, and that's what had gotten him thinking about this topic. And his supervisor there was an older man, and he thought that that's how he saw this character being. But then he realized that having a younger man opened up so many other avenues for the story. So I think that we would have to agree that it does, and it allows to mark him as further different than the men he encounters in the town, at least most of them. Jacob, did you have any thoughts on what Dana said?
Sure. Dana, thank you for the kind words. I'm glad you enjoyed the film. And I loved the way you described Clift's character as a sort of unformed man. There's an interesting comment that Carol, Lee Remick's character, makes in the tail end of the movie, where she says to him something to the effect of, you're starting to become a real human, and that's appropriate. It's precise. To me, one of the things that, marks the development of his character, through the course of the film, between the beginning and the end, is that he starts to engage with the situation. He begins by engaging with the situation as a bureaucrat and a functionary. He thinks he's going to take Ella Garth off the island in one day. And he approaches it as a sort of perfunctory task. But over the course of the film, he starts to engage with her and her community as humans. And that's when he too sort of, fills in, to my reading at least. So thanks again for your take, Dana.
I just want to remind folks, if you are from outside the sort of greater Philadelphia area, we'd love to know where you're joining us from. So please introduce yourselves and tell us where you're from in the chat. We'd appreciate it. Let's see. Charles, you had a question or comment.
Go ahead. I didn't know we'd be seeing a local hero without the laughs. It's very similar in the plot, the Deus Ex Machina that moves the plot along. There's an emissary that's sent, in one case from the TVA and the other from Popper Oil, to get the people off the land. Almost everyone agrees, but there's one holdout. And then the mission changes. The mission changes for Hopper, Burt Lancaster, who leaves satisfied. If you remember, Peter Riegert in Local Hero is not satisfied. He really wants to trade. So there's a major difference. I'll grant you there are major differences all the way through, but the whole kind of overview of the plot is very similar.
Okay.
People's comments on that.
Well, thanks, Charles. I will say that this movie came first. That's one thing. The other thing I would say is I do find it interesting when a movie in one genre or a movie that comes along is sort of turned, I won't say into a different genre, but sort of a strong element of comedy is added. I think about one of my favorite movies, Strangers on a Train, being turned into Throw Mama from the Train, and how the passage of time and the change in sensibilities over the decades allows that to happen. I would also say that I think this is a pretty common story in general. I mean, one, it's a very easy way to set up a fish out of water story, which is or story of an outsider coming into some sort of specific enclave. And I think that that's a story, that, in general, we see a lot and people never get tired of seeing. But yes, there are some similarities. Jacob, your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks for connecting this film into a sort of larger web, Charles. I'm thinking, to other movies that connect to, and some of you here with us tonight may have been with us a couple weeks ago when we talked about The Magnificent Ambersons, another film about progress and the cost of progress. I don't have too much to add beyond that, but it's interesting to think about the way that, this subject, which is, sort of so crucial to our, I guess, national identity and our sort of project as, a nation and as a people, like how it's portrayed in this film. Kazan, I think, is somebody who recognizes its necessity and recognizes the necessity of, the TVA's work. We have that harrowing footage at the beginning of the film. But he understands too that there's a cost that comes with it, that there's something paid for it. And I think he felt that we shouldn't forget that. So.
Let's see, David, you have a question or comment?
I do, and I wanted to first thank Jacob for some of the comments that he made on the advance video, and it led me to a little bit of research back to the McCarthy days. And as I watched the movie, I was struck a little bit by trying to put together what occurred with Kazan and the McCarthyism and his having testified. I mean, he's one of many who gave names, but there also were many who did not, and they got treated differently afterwards. And his view from his experience with the government, I'm using that sort of in the quotes, and how that impacts his view here of the government. And I found that he was both being critical and making excuses for the government in the film, appropriately in many regards, and used the characters that we're talking about in part to sort of accomplish his view of the government and how people reacted. I thought that he had a little trouble trying to develop the different types of characters fully for us. I thought that Walter Clark was just one step short of the development that I thought he might have been able to get. We got a fair amount from him, but I felt like I was missing a little bit, and a little bit of that from the other Southern gentlemen as they were describing themselves in his office, that early scene. So just putting that together, and each of you, but Jacob, certainly you had the advanced comments, and any thoughts you had on the link to the McCarthy hearings issue and how Kazan focused in there, and what effect that had on him before and after. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Yeah, when Kazan went through his ordeal with HUAC, it, as he would like to remind people, it cost him some things, but it certainly didn't cost him as much as it cost many others, as you alluded to. And I think that it attempting to map his view or his version of those events onto this film is tricky. And I think in part it's complicated by the fact that he says, and I think we have no reason to doubt him on this count anyway, he says that he underwent a bit of a change of thinking over the course of of researching and writing and making the film. He would say that he was not a communist. He saw what the CPUSA was doing, what they were up to, and thought they were destructive, and that's why he testified. That's his story. It had nothing to do with his career, et cetera, et cetera. He thought it was the right thing to do. Though some people may put the CPUSA and the New Deal in the same camp, they were not, in fact, in the same camp. And they're different organizations with different missions and different members, obviously. And he did consider himself a staunch New Dealer. And he initially said he found it tough to have any sort of empathy for or see the views at all of what he initially described as the reactionary folks who weren't sort of going to get with the program, so to speak. But he says over the course of making the film, he came to develop some sense of understanding for them and a bit more sort of, I don't know if acceptance is strong enough, but tolerance for their point of view. So I think the film has some ambivalence on the sort of question of the government versus the individual and those sorts of things. And I think that comes through. And unfortunately, and this may be what some people are reacting to with their dislike of the film, unfortunately, ambivalence and the narrative Hollywood film are very hard to put together successfully. Jacob, your thoughts?
Yeah, David, thanks for weighing in. So you, I'll speak specifically to, I'll try specifically to relate this to the House Committee of Un-American Activities matters with Kazan. One thing that I alluded to in my introduction and that I'll mention again here is many people have noticed that in Kazan's post-testimony work after 1952, which is generally work that he was more invested in and was more involved in developing, we see the theme of betrayal come up, whether it is a major, function of the plot or whether it is just, a sort of detail layered in. But we see this come up in a number of his post-testimony movies. And so I think there's a hint of this in Wild River 2, albeit in an interesting way, and in a sort of morally ambiguous way. In particular, I'm thinking of the ways that the various family members of the Garth family, or the people who live in her community and on her land, start to, move to the other side of the issue. We see Lee Remick's character beginning this relationship with Chuck Glover, played by Clift, and she says, and Ella says to her, "I just don't know how you can go over to the enemy." We see Ella's sons, become willing to, change their minds and become willing to take legal action to have her declared senile. There's a really striking moment as she's being evicted, where as she's walking off, we see all the people who used to work on her land, mostly from the African-American community, standing there with their axes, getting ready to chop everything down. And there's a sort of glance that's traded between Ella and these people who used to work on her land. So, like everything else in Wild River, this is not it's morally complicated. We do have the sense that, in the ultimate balance of things, this is something that needs to happen. It's work that needs to be done, and it's right that she leaves the land. But emotionally, it's difficult. There's an emotional sting to turning away from somebody in your group or in your family, or going against their wishes, doing something that is damaging to them. And I think Kazan does a really good job of making that sort of, even though we can sort of maybe ideologically, justify their actions, Kazan does a good job of making that sort of turn or betrayal, if you want to call it that, sting emotionally, and makes us feel that. So.
Let's see, Barbara and Richard, you have a question or comment?
Thanks, Andrew, and and thanks, Jacob, for recommending these movies. And by the way, thanks for this entire Monday series. It's been really fabulous, and it's kind of like a lifeline to normalcy. It's one of the movies that I didn't particularly love. I don't want to speak for Barbara, but I would want to see again. I felt like the audience was very much a character in the movie. And a little bit of what I read afterwards online, I can't remember which essay it was, said that, in the 1930s, Elia Kazan would have been, a gung-ho New Dealer. And by the time he made the movie, he was more aware of the complexity of this. And I just want to mention in passing that it happened that we watched it on Saturday night on the 4th of July, on the same day that the New York Times Magazine ran an article which mentioned in passing how African Americans were, predominantly farm workers or maids, and were left out a lot of the New Deal stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So what I felt drawn into was, in many ways, Joanne Fleet, who I know some people disagreed in the chat, I thought she was the center of the film. And I thought she was fabulous because Montgomery Clift finally figures out she's not afraid. She's got dignity. Her treatment of the African Americans is exemplary compared to what's happening on the mainland, with Bailey and those guys. So I had this sense that the audience was sort of set up to see these hillbillies, and the three sons who throw them in the water and so on, as caricatures. And by the time they betray her with a lawyer, I was totally on her side. And I was also very struck by the final scene of the movie where that little piece of land that's not submerged, survives, where she's buried. So I think that the audience was invited into, I think Elia Kazan kind of drew them into, you think you know what's going on here and who you support and who you don't. And let me make it more complicated for you, because by the time you're done, you kind of want her to stay there. And the scene of the burning of her house feels just so violative and violent. So it's not a movie I originally thought I wanted to see twice. But now I think that I would like to see it again, just to sort of watch. I think we as the audience, I'm almost done here, I know, Andrew. I think we as the audience are invited, along with Montgomery Clift, to realize there's more complexity going on here, and that her family's not afraid of her, and the African American community's not afraid of her. They respect her and what she stands for. And there's something very decent and dignified about who she is.
Yeah, I really appreciate those comments, Richard, and I think they say a lot about the film. And they make me think of another film that Kazan makes and around, during this run of his career, that is shot on location, despite the fact that it would have been much easier for it not to be. That invites people into a world they may not be familiar with, and tries to introduce people to a complicated issue with many sides, and that's On the Waterfront. And the reason that On the Waterfront, I would guess, seems so different is because, one, more of us have more knowledge and more of an opinion about the issues that film's dealing with. But more importantly, we know that Kazan, or we think we know that Kazan has a personal stake in that. We can see that film as being so clearly analogous to what he had just gone through, what Jacob described and others have described with HUAC, that we kind of don't give him the credit, if you will, even though many of us acknowledge it's a great film. We don't give him the credit for showing us the complexity and going into a location where it couldn't have been easy to make a film, and giving us this entry into a world and into, a region and its people that most of us wouldn't have otherwise. And I imagine most of us are more familiar with Hoboken than we are with rural Tennessee. And so there's that sense of familiarity. But the way you were describing it, to me, sounded a lot like Waterfront, and most especially the essential nature of the location shooting, which I think for this movie, for Wild River in particular, is even more important because it lends credibility to those performances. It lends credibility to all those, non-professional actors who fill out all those other parts, and it gives a physical, visible presence to the complexity of the situation that you were mentioning. Jacob.
Hey, thanks, Richard. And I would encourage you, if you're so inclined, to give the film another look. I think it's a film that reveals more in subsequent viewings. I loved what you said about the way that Kazan sort of begins by showing us a character in Ella Garth that we expect, not to empathize and sympathize with, but he builds sort of her case, or at least her perspective, throughout the movie. And in this sort of learning process, we're sort of aligned with, the process that Clift's character goes through. When he comes to the island, it seems to me that he thinks that the reason that they won't get off is because they don't understand what's going to happen. Like, they don't comprehend that the dam's going to open and it's going to be flooded. But it's plain when he talks to people that they understand perfectly. And so it begs the question, well, why won't Ella Garth sell her land? This is the question to me that's at the key of her character. And the answer, for me at least, lies in a comment that she makes where, she says, you can take me off this land by force. It won't take much, but it'll take some. And so what I think she's saying there, what I think that's all about, and I think this is revealing about where she's coming from in the film, is, this is essentially, the sale of a land makes it sound like a two-way deal, but it's not really a two-way deal. The government has decided it's going to do something, and it's taking the steps it needs to do it. And if she agrees to the sale of her land, she's almost sort of acting in this facade, like this is something that they've both agreed to, like this is a decision that she's a part of, but it's not. And she knows she's going to have to leave the land, and she's going to make them take her off. And the reason is because I think she wants to drop the pretense. She wants to force them to drop the pretense of it being a sort of mutual agreement. Now, what's that all about? For somebody like Ella, somebody who, has been on this land for decades, she talks about how she and her husband, developed it from, wild land, where that they've staked their whole life on, that it's been this sort of independent, defining initiative for them. To sort of play along with the pretense that, okay, I'll go along with this. I'll sell this land, at the price that you've offered me, and I'll leave it willingly, is humiliating. It would be humiliating to her. And so I think she needs to take a stand, And I think, the turning point for Montgomery Clift is when he says, oh, you're after your dignity. That's what you're after. It's not until he understands that, that he starts to have any grasp on the situation at all. But I think Kazan does a good job of helping us understand, a character who seems to be doing the wrong thing, and I think is doing the wrong thing, who is standing in the way of something that needs to happen. Kazan does a good job of making us understand at least where she's coming from.
And I think something that you certainly implied, Jacob, and maybe you went further than that, is that there's also a sense of honesty and integrity about it. A decision made at the point of a bayonet is not a decision freely made, and her decision is not being freely made. And when you mentioned that key line when she says, it'll take force, not a lot, but some. That's her way of saying everybody has to know that I'm not making this decision freely. I know I'm not going to win, but everybody needs to know that this isn't, as you said, Jacob, a sale where both people benefit and get what, give up something and get something. And I think that's an important element of it too. Let's see, Meredith, do you have a question or comment?
I do. I wanted to first circle back to Lee Remick. First of all, I really appreciated this film. I'd never seen it before. I'd never even heard of it. And I think the portrayal of her character and her sexual agency is kind of shocking, So I was wondering if we could talk a little bit more about that. I also love the line where she says, I'm smarter than you at times. I mean, when's the last time you've heard that, in a movie of this era? And I guess kind of related to that, I was wondering if you could talk about the scene where Montgomery Clift first goes to the island, and it's very clear he's encountering this matriarchy, where all these women just kind of stare him down and turn away one by one.
Yeah, I mean, I think her character is one of the sort of inspired elements of the film, and one of the things that makes it sort of more interesting than a you know, kind of a log line reading would lead you to believe. Jacob, we were talking before we came on about, you know, how, you know, the film isn't well known and it didn't do well at the box office, and I talked about, you know, I mentioned like the ambiguity of it and the complexity, and Jacob said, yeah, it's not exactly a story that's tailor-made for the 20th Century Fox marketing department, or words to that effect. And I think that's true. And you can't explain, and I don't know what good it would have done at the time anyway, that there are these fascinating dynamic characters like the one played by Lee Remick. And I think that, you know, I think that when people talk about that, you know, they don't know exactly why she would have fallen in love with Montgomery Clift. I think it's that he's not threatened by her, and she can be more forward, more assertive, more herself than she can be, obviously, with the other man that she is sort of, you know, considering marrying, or who's been chosen for her sort of by the town, so to speak. And so, you know, I think that's one reason. He doesn't only seem to sort of accept or tolerate it, he seems to kind of to like it about her. And I mean, that's, for some people, that'd be reason enough to love the guy. Jacob.
Yeah, thanks for bringing up this character. To me, Lee Remick's performance is awesome. I cannot believe how good she is in this movie. And I think the character is fascinating and really atypical for a film of this period. So, right, you talked a little bit about the unusual sexual agency that she has in this film, and also the sort of insight and, you know, in willingness, in at times assertiveness that she has, also unusual for, you know, a character at this time. One of the things that I wanted to mention is, you know, one of the things that I think Kazan does really cleverly is he takes some of the dynamics that we see in this sort of A plot, you know, about the land, you know, this sort of push and pull between tradition and progress, this sort of dynamic of like wildness, you know, against control or taming things. And he like also brings those to bear, you know, in the romantic relationship. And I think, you know, those are most apparent in Lee Remick's character. You know, she's somebody who, tradition and progress, you know, she's somebody who has roots in a really profound way. And they're roots that have served her, you know, that have given her a place to go and a support system after she goes through a tragedy. And she's sort of faced with weighing, you know, that against, you know, the feeling of having a life elsewhere, you know, having a life that's more expansive. By the same token, I mean, right, she's this character who sort of radiates this kind of sexual energy and this sexual intensity, which is, I think, in and of itself kind of unusual for films of this period. But it's interesting because we also watch her weighing that against, not with any sort of moralizing impulse, but we watch her weighing this sort of passionate drive against trying to protect herself emotionally, you know, as she sort of wades into the relationship. You know, one of the things that she says early on as her affair with Clift's character begins, she says, you know, I need to protect myself. I don't want to be hurt again. You know, but we can sense that there's this sort of strong, passionate connection too. One of the things that I think is amazing about her, she speaks directly and frankly, you know, in this way that you can imagine somebody like Montgomery Clift has probably never confronted. This is what she brings to the table, you know, I think in their relationship that both attracts him and sort of makes him nervous, because she speaks directly. She tries to have at several points a really direct and honest conversation about, you know, about their relationship, their future, and their needs, which I think is like an incredibly sort of mature and impressive thing to do, especially you know, when that sort of agency and that sort of insight is put in a character who, you know, we assume is not very educated, you know, is lower class, you know, and so forth. So anyway, that I hope that I hope that's useful.
Roseanne, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I do. Thanks for calling on me. I love this movie. I'm a history buff, so I absolutely loved it. I love the comments by the townspeople against Roosevelt. But the comment, well, I have a comment and then I have a question. So my comment is that I think that Lee Remick was a real heroine in this movie. You see her from the point of being a sad widow who has really no voice to becoming this person who really asserts herself and says, you know, I'm going to leave this town with you or without you. I mean, that's huge, right? Mm-hmm. And the movie takes place in 1930, but Kazan makes it in 1960. So for me, that was huge. So I think she's a real heroine in the movie. But my question is that, you know, with respect to how Black people were treated in the movie, you know, I think everything, even when you consider, I'm not a religious person, but even when you consider the Bible, you know, everything happens in its time and place, right? So with respect to how Black people were treated, you know, that's how it was then. And I'm not so sure, to tell you the truth, that it wouldn't be a whole lot different today. So anyway, I wanted you to comment on that, but thanks for listening to me.
Well, sure, Roseanne. Thanks for your comments and your feedback. I do have to say that there's an important. It's a small moment, but it's an important moment when Montgomery Clift sort of talking to the brothers after they've, you know, the next day after they've thrown him in or whatever, and he says, they're talking about work, and he says, how would you guys work? And you know, what do you do for work now? And he's like, we don't. The brothers are like, we don't work. We basically, you know, they sort of imply they take a cut. I think they're implying they take a cut of what the Black farm laborers sort of do, or the rent they pay them to farm on their land, or some arrangement like that. I do think that aspect of it would be different today. I don't think they'd be able to be, I don't think that arrangement exists very much anymore, if at all. And I certainly don't think that they would feel so comfortable saying that they just live off the labor of these. I don't think the white men would be so comfortable saying they live off the labor of these people, that they don't sort of, that have limited options particularly at that time. So I think things would be a little different, but to say that there's still, you know, a big divide and a class difference and other, you know, sort of entrenched differences in that region in particular, but in other places too, between the races, I think that certainly is still, unfortunately, a true statement. Jacob.
Yeah. Thanks for the lead, Andrew. I agree with you. You know, we see that the African American community on the Garth's Island seems to be treated better than they are on the mainland, at least by the civic authority. But you know, even with that, it's not as, you can't look at that and say this is an equitable situation. I mean, there's clearly a dynamic that is at least social and probably, you know, economic and other things too. So, you know, how does this square with the film? How does this square with the way we read the film? I don't know. You know, it's something that I've been kind of chewing on. I mean, it's certainly striking to see it, you know, in this day and age. There's an extent to which that probably is the representation of a time and place. There's also an element, I wonder, you know, a lot of what I think Kazan's doing throughout this film is just complicating things and complicating things and complicating things. And he starts to there's many ways in which he makes us appreciate the region, the specialness of the place, the tradition of the place, the kind of society they have too. But there's an ugliness to it too, you know. There's things about it that are, grotesque. Certainly, it's sort of racial dynamics. We see it in a very direct way with regards to, the racist guys who come see Montgomery Clift at his inn. But we see it, woven into the whole fabric of the society. So, yeah, it's complicated,
In fact, the film at the time received mixed reviews, and one of the sort of prevailing, negative or critical strains of those reviews was that Kazan sort of brings too many issues to the party, and that he sort of added race in this movie about land rights and the TVA and the New Deal and all that. And I think Kazan's response to that would have been, I don't know what it was actually, but my guess is it would have been, you can't separate that out. You can't sort of say, you can't make this movie about that time and that place, and even that issue of the land, and not have the questions about race and the issues of race enter into it. And so I think he was probably smart enough of a storyteller to know he was perhaps complicating things too much to have a as commercially palatable movie as he might have. But to his credit, I think he thought he couldn't extricate or separate that issue, and I think he was right.
Yeah. Can I just make one more brief comment? I saw this come up, flicker across in the chat, but someone noted that, one of the things, or one of the elements of, racism in the movie is that the Black characters aren't, never really get beyond a sort of character sketch. They're all fairly flat characters. And I think that's a legit criticism of the film. They are pretty perfunctory. So, we have to call it as we see it. Yeah.
Let's see. Joss, you had a question or comment.
Yeah, I wanted to get back to this film in the context of Kazan's other work, the use of location, and how those things relate to each other. One of the early comments in the discussion, I think it was from Robert, was that this was an inferior film to Streetcar and On the Waterfront and so on. But I think it was completely different in tone. Part of that, and a lot of that came from the location, which has come up in the discussion also. And this was a rural, laconic, out of the way sort of place. The pace of life was very slow compared to some of the other locations and settings in his other films, including Streetcar, New Orleans, and certainly On the Waterfront, which is a very urban setting. And even a film we saw early in this series, Facing the Crowd, which was heavily into TV and media and glamorization of life. And this one was completely different. And it all came out of it. A lot of it came out of the setting. So it was a little more of a low-key film than those other films. But that was part of what it was about. I just wonder if anybody had any thoughts about that.
Well, thank you, Joss. No, I mean, I think you're exactly right. I mean, I think that, going back to, again, to what Jacob said about this being a challenge for marketing, I mean, oh boy, let's all run out and see that movie about land rights and race in the 1930s. I mean, it's just not as, it's not, even though you could say On the Waterfront is about, union corruption, at least you're going to have fights and gunshots and, tough guys pushing each other around and all that in setting that will at least have a view of the New York skyline, even though it's set in New Jersey. So, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, it's a different animal. It's a different thing than any of those other three of his earlier works you mentioned. And I think that, you know, it's hard. I think it's so different that it's hard to sort of compare the kind of the quality of any one given element, because it is such a, to me, it is such a different endeavor in some ways. Although I think thematically, I think Jacob's done a really good job of spelling out how thematically there's a consistency through this and Kazan's other movies of the era. But I think in many other ways, it's a very different film that makes such comparisons really difficult. Jacob.
Yeah, I think that's a good observation. I mean, Kazan's origins were in the theater. There's a theatricality that comes through to many of his films, and this is definitely one with a much more subdued tone. I think I don't think though that is at the expense of emotional intensity, because I think there's at least two extremely intense performances in the film. There's a lot of intensity, both from Ella Garth, played by Jo Van Fleet, and also, of course, Lee Remick's character, who sort of smolders at certain points. But it all, you know, it's mostly a pretty subdued, a film with a pretty mellow mode, and, you know, none of the sort of histrionics that we see in, say, like A Face in the Crowd or Streetcar, or anything like that. Now, you commented on the use of land, you know, in the film, this sort of land being not just the setting, but almost like a sort of character in the film. And I think that's a very astute observation too. You know, one of the things that Kazan does cleverly in the film is there's a lot of really beautiful sort of tableau shots in the film where he just like frames his characters, you know, in the land, these like beautiful long shots that really sort of ground them in their environments. And we really have a sense that, you know, the people who live here and the place where they live are, you know, inseparable from each other.
Nanine, you have a question or comment? Okay. Janet, you have a question or comment?
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah. Hi. Yeah, I really love these discussion points, like the location of shooting and the historical facts are important to the film, the heightened theatricality of some of the performances. But I want to talk more about the blacks. You know, so they were. They didn't just have limited options, or there weren't just many in the film and then they added race. I mean, this is almost perhaps an accurate historical portrayal of these descendants of slaves who were so submissive and barely responsive. Even they couldn't even look us or their owner, I mean, really, wasn't she like a plantation owner, in the eye? The violence suggested and demonstrated by Bailey and the others, it's not even just embedded Jim Crow laws. They were endangered. They couldn't go into the town without being called boy, or perhaps being, you know, threatened in some way. Of course, they worked for $2 a day instead of $5 a day. And in these current days, when we are rereading James Baldwin, and, you know, the current conversation would say that, wow, this is really important. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's an important element of the film, which is why Kazan, you know, probably against his sort of more commercial instincts, knew he had to leave it in there and knew it had to be depicted. And I have to say, to be fair, I think that there are, you know, there are differences in, I mean, I was stunned that when the Bailey character explains, you know, goes to Montgomery Clift's hotel room and explains to him how he handled his former employee who took a job for better pay. I found that shocking, and I found it shocked that the sort of matter-of-factness by which the Bailey character shared that. I found the act that he described and shocking, and I found the fact that he thought that that was appropriate for a person, an employee who wanted to find different work. But I think it draws a contrast to the situation on the Garth's Island. I mean, the people on that island obviously sort of, I shouldn't say obviously, it doesn't seem like they're sort of equal shareholders in what's going on there, but at the same time, they're not sort of, you know, treated and disciplined in the same way that character is. And I only, the way Bailey did, and I only mention that to say that even at this time in this film, whether it's, we want to think about the sensibility of 1960 or the sensibility of when it's set in 1930, there's still a range, all of which are problematic to varying degrees, but there are varying degrees. And I think that that's another, you know, that's another feather in the film's cap for showing the complexity of that issue within an issue. Jacob.
Yeah. Well, thank you for bringing this up. Yeah. So, like as I said before, I mean, to me, yeah, I think it's a fair. I would take it as a fair criticism that, you know, the film's Black characters are a little bit two-dimensional, but I do think that as the way that they are presented as a community, I would not characterize them as you know, innately, you know, submissive or even, you know, cowed to the point of stasis. You know, one of the things that's striking is that, you know, it's sort of the implication, and there's a part in the film where Montgomery Clift's character talks with a bunch of African-American workers who are sort of hanging out on the riverbank. And the sort of implication of their conversation is that the reason they haven't left the island is that they're not sure what their options are if they leave. And once they're presented with a sort of viable option to relocate, they relocate, you know. You know, once Clift's character can provide them, you know, a sense of, you know, where they can live and some employment opportunities, they take that up. So I think so I do think this sort of, at least sketch of the African-American community broadly is, has some nuance to it. Yeah.
Nanine, I see you're with us now. What's your question or comment?
Yeah, I'm calling from Southern California.
Oh, wow.
I wanted to comment on offer a larger context, historical context for the last shot in the film of the burial grounds, which is so moving how Ella's grave, somebody mentioned before, also persists, where she's finally completely one with the land. And so progressively across her lifetime, more and more identified until she's inseparable from the land. So also going on at this time and through most of the 20th century was a battle between the Cherokees who also had their burial sites flooded by the Tennessee Valley Authority. Mm-hmm. And that larger sense of people's identification with the land through and beyond death. In the mid-19th century, there was an affidavit written in Cherokee that came across my desk, and I'm not a lawyer, I'm a therapist, but across the desk of a law firm in Philadelphia in 1979. So this is still going on. This is an affidavit translated into English from the Cherokee language that said, it was written in 1869. Our ancestors will look up at iron birds as through a wall of glass. So this was before airplanes, this prophetic writing was.
Nanine, I'm sorry to interrupt, but could you tie this back into the film for us?
Yeah, that the Tennessee Valley Authority flooded the burial sites of the Cherokees. This is a budding Tennessee. So it's the same issue. Only in that case, you know, it's interesting to wonder about the film. Like, was it a coincidence? You know, it's only a coincidence that her burial site was not flooded by the dam. You know, it was not flooded by the river, would not have been flooded by the river. And it's the control of mankind, you know, that she was supposed to, you know, what we call progress, that in fact, you know, was oblivious to people's identification with their land in life and in death. So I think it's, you know, another version of the same story, where the burial sites that they fought for against the Tennessee Valley Authority were flooded.
I think that's a very interesting point, right? Because this one thing you've made clear that those two sort of the issues with those two different communities have in common is that there are these people, outsiders coming in, who can't conceive of the relationship that the people feel with the land. They just can't conceive of it, and that is something that has certainly been true the history of the sort of the U.S. government and European settlers with Native Americans, but it's true on a smaller level, I would say, with Montgomery Clift and the family in this film. He and the people he works for are incapable of understanding the nature of the connection she feels to her land.
Yes.
Thank you. Let's see, last comment or question from Howard, if he's still there.
Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay, Howard.
Hi there. Yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed the film. I thought it was a great selection. Hard to believe that the issues we're dealing with today are go back to 1930. But there are two specific questions I have. One is for Jacob. Jacob, in the intro that was part of what was sent out last week, I believe you mentioned that Montgomery Clift had a fairly serious car accident, and you indicated that you thought this may have impacted his acting in this film. And second question I have is that Walter and Chuck become friends very quickly. I didn't quite understand that, because they are both appear to be competing for the love and affection of Carol. And that just was part of the story that just seemed disjointed. And I'm wondering if you could comment on that as well.
Thank you, Howard. I will comment on my rather admittedly simple view of the second point about the friendship. My enemy's enemy is my friend. And Walter quickly realized that Walter thought he had more in common with Bailey and the other men in the town, which is why he agreed to sort of help set up Montgomery Clift to begin with. But he thinks better of it, because he knows it dawns on him that the Clift character is at least a decent fellow, and those other guys are far from it, and won't fight fair and won't draw lines. And so I think he you know, despite what is happening, he feels a kinship with him, and he would, if he has to pick a side, he'd rather pick his side than the side of Bailey and those other fellas. And regarding the romantic competition, all I can say is if it dawns on him that Lee Remick isn't interested in him, I mean, who wants to try to, what sort of decent fellow wants to try to force someone's hand in that regard? But those are my thoughts. Jacob.
Sure. Thanks, Howard, for raising these points. So speaking first to Clift, his accident, and you know, the effect that may have had on his career. Right. So Clift was in a bad car accident in 1956, and as he recovered from that accident, he began to develop some pretty serious alcohol and drug problems, which would eventually kill him. And certainly, I think, impacted both his ability to secure good roles and, you know, some people say his performances. So to me, the sort of, I don't consider this performance to be a compromised one. Andrew, you and I were talking about this a little bit before we started, but there is a sort of like, leading man swagger that you see in early Clift roles and that you often see in Hollywood, you know, male leads, that Clift doesn't bring to this film. And I don't think, but I think that's appropriate. I think that fits the character. So to me, as I've said at other points in this conversation, I think this is a rich performance. But speaking historically, Clift's reputation was starting to suffer, at the time that he made Wild River. And I've read that Kazan exacted a promise from Clift that he wouldn't drink during the filming, that Clift didn't. I don't know if that's apocryphal or not. But up to your second point about the friendship between the two men, this is a curious aspect of the film. I think, as Andrew said, there is a sort of alliance against greater evils, perhaps. But there's this sort of strange angle, too, where for much of the movie, bizarrely, Clift is almost angling for things for Carol to ultimately marry this guy, there's a confrontation between them, early on where, or it's the first time they come face to face, and Walter says, "So you'll be leaving soon, won't you? You take my point." And Clift says, "Yes, I take your point." And then later, sort of just before the house gets assaulted, Remick is kind of laying it all out. She's sort of laying it bare, to Clift, and is asking him directly if, to take her with him when he leaves. And he suggests that she should stay and marry Walter. What's that all about? Well, I think, we've talked a lot about this, pull between the known and the unknown, between tradition and progress, and commitment and freedom. And that there's an element of that in Clift's character too. He is intransigent in his own way. He's sort of unwilling to forge the connection, he's very tentative about a commitment with Lee Remick's character, through much of the film. She tries to pin him down on it several times. And he, he's worried about committing to it. And I think his sort of out in the situation is that, eventually he'll leave and go his way, and she'll marry Walter. And that's not what she wants, but that's sort of what he hopes for, because it'll keep him from having to make any sort of commitment. And so I wonder if he's not sort of keeping that relationship with Walter alive because he sees them as being in some way part of the same project. Now, that's not what ultimately happens. I think he has a change of heart, but I think that's why he and Walter sort of strike this sort of strange, companionship, partnership, alliance. I don't know.
I think that's a good point. I think he thinks of the reasons the ways in which their relationship is improbable, and that's another important factor in why he and Walter have a friendship, or at least the sort of a gentleman's agreement, if you will, that they do. But thanks everybody for a really great discussion on wide-ranging topics with lots of really great questions and comments. We do this every Monday, barring holiday or blackout. So please, if you don't, sign up for our emails. Every Thursday, in our email, we send out a link to the introduction by the instructor, and obviously where you can see the film as well. In addition to these, we will in the coming week or so be announcing some additional seminars on specific film topics with different instructors that you can find out about as well. So there's a lot going on at brynmarfilm.org. Check out new films and one in particular great reissue coming up soon in our Theater 5 section. Learn about what's going on in film education in the Film Studies Online section. Check out the remote classroom. And if you like what we're doing, please consider making a donation to support Bryn Mawr Film Institute. We are getting things ready. We are coming up with plans. We are putting in place procedures for when it is safe to open. But as you know, we're not open yet, or else we wouldn't all be doing this over Zoom. So please consider supporting us if you're able, until we're able to meet and sell tickets and all get together at the theater. Until then, thanks very much, everyone, for joining us. And hopefully we'll see you next week. Take care.